Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for working with us on other committee hearings. Ranking Member Crapo started off this morning talking about the fact that I co-led a task force back in 2015 with Senator Schumer on international tax, and we had a lot of consensus. We agreed that the high corporate rate, highest in the OECD, and the worldwide system was simply unsustainable. And you remember what it was leading to. We had companies that were literally inverting, moving from the United States overseas. In fact, we had a number of inversions in Ohio. We were losing jobs, losing investment. The system was causing a lockout effect. That was the reality. And we recognized the need to transition to a better system. In that report, I just looked at it. We said, and I quote, when U.S. businesses can't compete and win in the global market, the real losers when they can't compete are U.S. workers. The real winners are U.S. workers when we can compete. And the TCJA reflected that consensus. So there were lots of parts of the bill that were relatively controversial. The international parts actually reflected that consensus, lower the rate, territorial system, and making our companies more productive and more competitive. And that's what has exactly happened. So there is a lot of investment that has occurred coming back into this country. I look at the IP side that was just talked about. New IP is largely now being done in America. And companies like Google brought its IP back, as did others. So that's the reality. And Ms. Olson, we've heard from Democrats and several panelists today that TCJA incentivizes offshoring. Specifically, they're pointing to the global intangible low taxed income, the GILTI minimum tax, and its allowances for qualified business asset investment, the QBI, to reduce the level of tax paid. However, this QBI is not a loophole. It's a recognition that earnings attributable to tangible property are not susceptible to profit shifting. In order for U.S. companies and businesses and workers to compete in foreign markets, they need to be where the customers are. Think of General Electric as an example. The engine plant is in Ohio. They sell a lot of engines overseas. That's good. We like that. It creates jobs here. But the servicing those engines has to be done in those foreign countries. They can't bring the engines back for service. We have Owens Corning in Ohio. They can't be competitive trying to ship glass halfway across the world. But we're glad they're an American company and that they're able to have foreign markets. Procter & Gamble in my hometown of Cincinnati, they cannot ship diapers from Ohio overseas profitably. It just can't be done. So the vast majority of foreign operations of U.S. companies serve foreign markets. In fact, approximately 90% of all sales of those foreign operations are to foreign customers and not an offshoring of operations to serve U.S. markets. That's data that is real. That's what's happening. So, Ms. Olson, do you believe GILTI's treatment of tangible assets is appropriate? And in your experience, does this actually incentivize U.S. companies to move U.S. assets or jobs overseas?
Thank you, Senator Portman. Yes, I do not think that the GILTI provisions have done anything to incentivize the movement of operations outside the U.S. What QBI does is to measure a return on tangible assets. When those tangible assets are in another country, they have primary jurisdiction to tax the income from it. That's all it does, is it recognizes that. There's been a long recognition that what's mobile is intangible income, and what intangible income is measured by in GILTI is a return on tangible assets in excess of 10%. So I think it exactly targets what it should target, and I don't believe that it provides any kind of incentive. I'm unaware of any company that has moved operations to take advantage of GILTI. Quite to the contrary, they try to escape it, and some of that escape is even subjecting themselves to subpart F or bringing the assets, as you mentioned, back to the United States to take advantage of the U.S. rate and FDII.
Yeah. Last week, we heard testimony in the committee on tax incentives for encouraging investment in the United States, something we should all want. Professor Hanlon from MIT testified that in terms of a company's next marginal decision, the lower corporate rate and the FDII are more likely to lead the decision to retain IP in the U.S. and also to manufacture in the U.S., all else constant. So FDII works in tandem with GILTI and provides a deduction from the GILTI tax for U.S. IP used abroad. A competitive effective rate is needed to prevent the GILTI provision from harming the competitiveness of U.S. companies relative to the foreign competitors. FDII is just as important to provide a disincentive against moving intangible property offshore. To quote from the legislative history of FDII that we just did in 2017, one of the committee's goals is to remove the tax incentive to locate intangible property abroad and encourage U.S. taxpayers to locate intangible income and potentially valuable economic activity in the U.S. Professor Hines, some academics have called for repealing FDII. Don't you think doing so would risk undermining the attractiveness of the U.S., not only as a place for locating intangible property, but also as a place for high-paying jobs in research and manufacturing?
Oh, yes, I completely agree. It would be a big mistake to repeal FDII for two reasons. One, because it encourages companies to locate their intellectual property and other high-tech stuff in the United States. And second, because it offers a more competitive tax rate on higher tech companies that are more internationally mobile. And those are the companies we want to make sure stay in the United States.
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me to ask questions today.
Thank you. Senator Wyden has gone over to vote. I don't know if he explained this to everybody, but we have a series of 4 votes going on right now on the PPP program. And we're going to be kind of switching out with each other while those votes go on. And we also have 3 hearings that many members of this committee are going on at the same time. So that's why we have a little bit of difficulty getting coordination of our attendance here. As a result of that, I don't see anyone else here at this moment who's in line. Senator Portman, if you had any other questions, you're certainly welcome to keep going. Do you have any other questions, Senator Portman?
I certainly do. And if you don't mind, Ms. Olson, I'd love your views on FDII. And in particular, doesn't it make sense as we're talking about reforms to be sure when we're looking at tax incentives to invest in America that we start with retaining FDII?
Yeah, I think FDII is an important provision, and I do think that you should retain it. I also think you need to take a look at R&D, which is, switches from expensing to capitalization and amortization next year as another thing that affects where R&D gets done. And I think it would behoove the committee to consider changing that provision so that we don't start driving R&D other places. R&D is so important in terms of the jobs it creates here in the United States, as well as the knock-on effects. And that's why other countries put so much effort into trying to attract that kind of investment. We're number 27 out of the 36 or whatever OECD countries when it comes to R&D incentives. We'll get worse once we switch from expensing to capitalization and amortization. And if we were to get rid of FDII, we'd probably fall to dead last.
Yeah, well, that's a great point. And we did hear quite a bit about the R&D issue and the fact that during the 2017 bill, it was really used as a pay for, not because of good policy reasons. And hopefully there's a bipartisan consensus that going to amortization does not make sense to encourage exactly what we all should want, which is more R&D to be done here in the United States. So my hope is that will be part of whatever package people are talking about putting through. My concern is that based on some of what I've heard today from some of my colleagues and some of the witnesses, that we could be shooting ourselves in the foot by doing away with FDII or otherwise making it more difficult for U.S. companies to invest here. And again, a lot of companies that are American companies are global companies. That's good. We want them to have markets overseas. It's not a bad thing that they're servicing GE aircraft engines overseas. Otherwise, GE wouldn't have the market in the first place. And so we've got to be, I guess, cognizant of the fact that there are going to be some foreign operations to serve foreign markets. And our tax code ought to encourage that. Do you agree with that, Ms. Olson?
Yes, wholeheartedly.
Right. Well, Mr. Chairman, thanks very much for allowing me to continue. And I appreciate your fitting us all in between our hearings and the votes and so on.
Thank you, Senator Portman.